The ancient bloodline of Morganthia had stood for 7 centuries, untouched by time, unbowed by mortal kingdoms, and unchallenged in the shadowed hierarchies of vampire nobility. Princess Seraphine Morganthia was the last jewel of that illustrious house, a creature of such devastating beauty that even her own kind whispered her name with reverence and fear. Her crimson eyes could pierce souls, her pale skin seemed carved from moonlight itself, and the massive wings that unfurled from her shoulders spanned wider than any vampire in living memory. She was perfection embodied, power incarnate, and she knew it with the absolute certainty that only immortality could breed. But perfection, as the Elder Council reminded her on that fateful night, did not grant immunity from consequence. The throne room of the Obsidian Court stretched vast and terrible before her, a cathedral of darkness where Gothic pillars rose like petrified giants toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. Blood-red banners bearing the ancient sigils of the great houses hung motionless in air that hadn't stirred in decades. Stained glass windows, each telling stories of conquest and carnage, filtered moonlight into streams of crimson, violet, and midnight blue that painted the black marble floors with fractured light. The very architecture seemed designed to diminish whoever stood at its center, to remind them of their insignificance against the weight of centuries. Seraphine stood in that center now, her wrists bound by chains forged not of metal but of pure concentrated moonlight, the only substance that could truly restrain one of her bloodline. The magical restraints hummed with silvery luminescence, sending tiny threads of pain through her flesh wherever they touched. She refused to flinch. Her wings, magnificent even in captivity, arched behind her in a display of defiance, their membranous surfaces catching the fractured light and throwing it back in shades of deepest burgundy. The 12 members of the Elder Council sat upon their elevated thrones arranged in a semicircle before her, their faces partially obscured by shadow and ceremony. Lord Malachar, the eldest among them, leaned forward, his voice dry as tomb dust yet carrying clearly through the cavernous space. Seraphine Morganthia, you stand accused of the gravest transgression a vampire of noble blood can commit. His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of whispered commentary from the assembled courtiers who watched from the gallery above. You fed upon Lord Caspian Blackthorn's human servants, not out of necessity, not in the heat of hunt, but deliberately, spitefully, knowing full well they were under his protection. You violated the Treaty of Ashen Crowns, the very foundation upon which our peaceful coexistence with the mortal realms is built. Seraphine's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it contained any warmth. Her fangs, delicate as pearl daggers, caught the light. Peaceful coexistence, she repeated, her voice a melody of silk and venom. Is that what we call our cowering in shadows while humans multiply across lands that once belonged to us? Is that what we name our self-imposed exile to the night while they claim the day? A murmur rippled through the assembly, part shock, part dark agreement. Lord Malachar's expression remained unchanged, carved from ancient stone and older patience. Your pride has always been your weakness, young one, he said softly, and somehow the gentleness made his words more terrible. But this time your pride has endangered us all. The Blackthorn alliance with the Eastern Kingdoms hangs by a thread. They demand satisfaction and we, he gestured to the other elders, must give it or risk war we cannot afford. Then give them war, Seraphine snapped, her wings spreading wider, the chains forcing them back with crackling resistance. Let us remind these mortals why they once feared the night. Enough. The word came from Lady Nocturne, whose beauty remained unmarred by the 15 centuries she had walked the earth. Your romanticism is as tedious as it is dangerous. The age of open war with humanity ended for a reason. We are immortal, yes. Powerful, yes. But we are few and they are endless. Every century they grow stronger, more numerous, their weapons more terrible. We survive not through conquest, but through calculated obscurity. Seraphine wanted to argue, to rage against the cowardice she saw in their ancient eyes, but something in Lady Nocturne's expression stopped her. There was sadness there, and memory, the kind that came from watching ages turn and civilizations fall. Lord Malachar stood, his robes cascading around him like liquid darkness. The sentence has been decided, Princess. You will marry a human. The words hung in the air like a curse, impossible and obscene. Seraphine felt her immortal heart, which beat only once per minute, suddenly hammer against her ribs in rapid, mortal terror. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, her voice for the first time losing its imperious edge. "A human? You would bind me to a creature that will age and die in less time than I take to master a new language." "A human noble," Lady Nocturne clarified, "from the Eastern Kingdoms. Lord Blackthorn has agreed to provide a candidate. Through this union, we will cement peace between our peoples, demonstrate our commitment to the treaty and," her eyes gleamed with something sharp, "teach you humility." "I will not." Seraphine's voice dropped to a growl that vibrated through her chest. Power gathered around her, making the air shimmer. "I will die first." "You cannot die, child," Lord Malachar said with infinite weariness. "That is our blessing and our curse. But you can suffer. You can know loneliness that spans centuries. You can watch everyone you might have loved turn to dust while you remain unchanging. This marriage will last but a blink of your immortal life. Consider it penance. Consider it education. But most of all," his voice hardened to iron, "consider it done." He raised his hand and the other elders mirrored the gesture. Ancient words in a language that predated Latin filled the chamber, resonating in the bones of all who heard them. Seraphine felt the binding settle over her like a shroud, a haze, an unbreakable magical compulsion woven into the very fabric of her being. She would attend this wedding. She would speak the vows. She would be bound to this human, however briefly his mayfly life might last. Her scream of rage shook the obsidian court, shattering 3 of the stained glass windows and sending terrified courtiers fleeing from the galleries. But beneath the rage, buried so deep she barely recognized it herself, was fear. Not of the human she would marry. What could a mortal do to one such as her? No, she feared what she sensed at the edges of the haze, in the careful wording of the elders' decree. She feared that they knew something she did not. Cassian Thorne had faced death more times than most men face their own reflections, but nothing in his 30 years of life had prepared him for this particular brand of insanity. He stood in the preparation chamber of the obsidian court, a room that somehow managed to be luxurious and unsettling in equal measure. The walls were draped in fabric so dark it seemed to absorb light, the furniture was carved from wood so black it looked like solidified shadow, and the mirror before him, which had taken him a disturbingly long moment to recognize as a mirror, reflected his image with an eerie perfection that made him look more real than reality. "You're actually going through with this," Marcus said from behind him, disbelief saturating every syllable. His oldest friend and captain of his guard stood with arms crossed, still wearing the travel-stained leathers from their 3-day journey into vampire territory. Cassian adjusted the high collar of his formal coat, black silk embroidered with silver thread in patterns that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. The vampire tailors had created the outfit in less than an hour, taking no measurements yet producing something that fit him as if it had been made for him since birth. "I'm aware of how this sounds, Marcus." "Are you?" "Because from where I'm standing, you're about to marry a vampire princess who reportedly tried to kill Lord Blackthorn's entire household. A vampire princess who is being forced into this marriage as punishment. A vampire princess who, by all accounts, would rather rip your throat out than look at you." Marcus moved to stand beside him, meeting his eyes in the uncanny mirror. "This is suicide with ceremonial dressing." "It's politics," Cassian corrected, his voice leveled despite the tension coiling in his shoulders. "And duty. The Eastern Kingdoms need this alliance. Our trade routes depend on vampire territory. Our northern borders are secured only because the vampires maintain the treaty. If this marriage can strengthen those bonds." "If it doesn't get you killed in your sleep first," Marcus interrupted darkly. "Cassian, you're a duke's second son, a decorated military commander, and a genuinely decent man, all things that give you value alive. Your brother inherited the title and the lands. You don't owe your family this sacrifice." Cassian turned from the mirror, fixing his friend with a look that had silenced subordinates and negotiated treaties. "My brother has 4 children to protect. My father's health fails. Our duchy stands on the edge of vampire lands. If my marriage can guarantee another generation of peace, Then yes, Marcus, I owe my family exactly this sacrifice. What he didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that the alternative was worse. The vampires had demanded satisfaction for Princess Seraphine's crime. The elders had offered marriage or they would withdraw entirely from the treaty, leaving the eastern kingdoms vulnerable to other threats that lurked in the dark places of the world. Lord Blackthorn himself had come to Cashin, had explained the situation with the kind of desperate pragmatism that left no room for romantic notions of choice. "You're the best option," Blackthorn had said, his vampire eyes unreadable. "You're young enough to be appealing, highborn enough to satisfy honor, and you've fought in the border wars. You know how to survive dangerous situations. Most importantly, you're not an idiot. You'll need all of that to survive her." Not exactly a ringing endorsement for matrimony. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A vampire servant entered, a young woman with a pale skin and crimson eyes that marked her kind, though her demeanor was almost painfully deferential. "My Lord Thorn, the ceremony is prepared. The council and the princess await your presence." Cashin nodded, ignoring the way his heart rate accelerated. He'd led cavalry charges against overwhelming odds. He'd negotiated peace with warlords who spoke 12 languages of violence before learning diplomacy. He'd survived 3 assassination attempts before his 25th birthday. He could walk into a room with an angry vampire princess. Probably. The servant led them through corridors that seemed to twist in ways architecture shouldn't allow, past windows that showed impossible views, angles of the courtyard that couldn't exist simultaneously, perspectives that made his mind hurt if he looked too long. Marcus muttered prayers under his breath, one hand on his sword hilt despite knowing how useless it would be here. They emerged into the throne room and Cashin felt his breath catch despite himself. He'd seen beauty before. He'd courted noble women whose portraits were painted by masters, had danced with princesses at royal balls, had even had a brief, passionate affair with a sorceress whose magic made her supernaturally alluring. Nothing compared to the creature that stood in chains at the center of the vast chamber. Princess Seraphine Morganthia was a study in contradictions, delicate and dangerous, elegant and feral, beautiful and terrifying. Her skin was so pale it seemed to glow against the darkness surrounding her, flawless as carved marble but with an impossible vitality that no statue could capture. Her hair fell in waves of midnight silk, shot through with highlights that shifted between deep crimson and purple depending on how the light caught it. But it was her eyes that truly arrested him, pools of liquid crimson that burned with an inner fire, intelligence and fury and something else he couldn't quite name dancing in their depths. The wings were beyond anything he'd imagined. They rose from her shoulders like a declaration of divine artistry, massive and membranous, structured with elegant bones visible through translucent tissue that ranged from deep burgundy at the base to almost transparent at the edges. They would have dwarfed him if she spread them fully, would have cast him entirely in shadow. Even now, partially folded and bound by those chains of solidified moonlight, they dominated the space, made everything else seem small and mortal and temporary. She was dressed in a gown that seemed woven from darkness itself, gothic and elaborate, with a high collar that framed her face and long sleeves that ended in points across the backs of her hands. A crown of black metal and dark rubies rested on her head, but she wore it not as adornment but as armor, as a reminder of what she was, royalty, power, immortality incarnate. And she was looking at him with an expression of such pure, concentrated loathing that he almost turned around and walked back out. "So," her voice drifted across the space like smoke, beautiful and poisonous, "this is the human they've bound me to. How underwhelming." Cashin had negotiated enough treaties to recognize a power play when he saw one. She was testing him, trying to establish dominance from the first moment. He'd expected nothing less. He walked forward, his boots clicking against the marble floor, closing the distance between them with steady, unhurried steps. Marcus started to follow, but Cashin raised a hand, halting him. This part he had to do alone. The Elder Council watched from their elevated thrones, ancient faces betraying nothing. The assembled vampire courtiers in the galleries above leaned forward, hungry for drama, for blood, for anything to break the tedium of immortality. Cashin felt their eyes like physical weight, but he kept his focus on Seraphine, refusing to be the first to look away. He stopped just outside the range of her chains, close enough to speak normally, far enough to respect the danger she represented. Up close she was even more devastating. Her features were sharp and elegant, with high cheekbones and a jaw that managed to be both delicate and strong. Her lips were the color of aged wine, and when she smiled mockingly at him, he caught a glimpse of fangs as delicate as they were deadly. "Princess Seraphine," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the vast space. "I'm Cashin Thorn and I'm here to marry you." She laughed, a sound like crystal breaking, beautiful and sharp enough to cut. "How wonderfully direct. Tell me, Lord Thorn, do you have any idea how long I'll live?" "Centuries. Millennia if I'm careful. You'll be dead and dust before I've even noticed the passage of time. Marrying you is like," she tilted her head considering, "like adopting a particularly troublesome pet that I'll have to watch wither and die." "Romantic," Cashin replied dryly. "I can see why the Elder Council chose you as their ambassador for vampire-human relations." Several of the courtiers above gasped. Marcus made a strangled sound. Even the elders stirred slightly, attention sharpening. No one spoke to a vampire princess like that, certainly not a human facing one in chains who would eventually be released. Seraphine's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Cashin thought he'd badly miscalculated. Power gathered around her, making the air shimmer. Her wings rustled, chains clinking. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed again, this time with genuine surprise. "Oh, you have teeth after all," she murmured, studying him with new interest. "I was afraid they'd sent me some cowering diplomat who would spend our entire marriage apologizing for existing." "I don't apologize for existing," Cashin said. "And I won't apologize for the fact that neither of us wants this marriage. But here's what I am willing to do." He took one step closer, close enough now that she could reach him if she extended her arms, chains and all. "I'm willing to treat you with respect. I'm willing to honor the vows we're about to speak, however unwillingly. And I'm willing to try to make this arrangement bearable for both of us." "How magnanimous," she drawled, but some of the venom had left her voice. "And what, exactly, do you expect in return for this grand gesture?" "The same," he said simply. "Respect. Honor. A chance to survive this with both our dignities intact." She stared at him for a long moment, her crimson eyes searching his face for something: deception, weakness, fear. He met her gaze steadily, letting her look, letting her see whatever she needed to see. "You're not what I expected," she finally admitted, her voice softer, almost puzzled. "You're either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Cashin agreed. "The line is often thinner than people think." Lord Malakar's voice interrupted before Seraphine could respond. "The hour grows late, and the ceremony must be completed while the moon reaches its apex. Lord Thorn, if you would take your position beside the princess." Cashin nodded and moved to stand beside Seraphine. Up close, he realized she was tall, her eyes level with his despite the fact that he stood over 6 feet. The chains that bound her wrists hummed between them, casting silvery light across both their faces. She smelled of night-blooming flowers and something else, something wild and dangerous that made his instincts scream warnings his rational mind was desperately trying to ignore. "If you try to kill me in my sleep," he murmured for her ears alone, "at least make it quick." Her lips twitched. Where's the fun in that? And despite everything, the absurdity of the situation, the danger, the certain knowledge that he was binding himself to a creature who could end him with barely a thought, Cashin felt himself smile. The ceremony began, and with it, his fate was sealed. The vampire marriage ceremony was nothing like the human rituals Cashin had witnessed countless times in his life. There were no priests offering blessings, no exchange of rings symbolizing eternal devotion, no gentle words about love and cherishing. This was older magic, darker power, the kind that predated Christianity and had been ancient when Rome was young. Lady Nocturne descended from her throne, moving with a grace that made walking seem like an art form. She carried a chalice carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface so black it seemed to be a hole in reality. Within it, liquid that glowed with a faint crimson luminescence sloshed gently as she approached. "Marriage among vampires is not a mere social contract," she began, her voice carrying a weight that suggested ritual words spoken for centuries. It is a binding of blood and magic, a joining of essence that transcends mortal understanding. When two of our kind wed, they share power, share life, share the very core of what they are. She turned her ageless eyes to Cashin. For a vampire to marry a human is unprecedented in recent centuries. The magic does not know what to make of it. The binding will be strange, unpredictable. You may share things you did not intend to share. You may become vulnerable in ways neither of you can anticipate. How reassuring, Seraphine muttered, though Cashin noticed her wings had drawn in slightly, a gesture he was learning to recognize as uncertainty. Lady Nocturne ignored the interruption. The heirs placed upon Princess Seraphine compels her to complete this ceremony, but the magic of the binding itself requires willingness, or at least acceptance, from both parties. Lord Thorn, knowing the risks, knowing the burden you take upon yourself, do you accept this union? Cashin thought of his family, of the trade routes, of the peace this marriage would buy. He thought of the border wars, of villages burned by creatures that lurked beyond vampire territories, of the fragile alliances that kept humanity safe from threats they barely understood. He thought of his brother's children, who deserved to grow up in a world not perpetually on the brink of supernatural war. But more than any of that, he looked at Seraphine, at the proud set of her shoulders despite the chains, at the defiance burning in her eyes even as magical compulsion forced her to stand here, at the fear she was trying so hard to hide beneath her contempt. She was going to be bound to him, her immortal life shackled to his brief human span, and she had even less choice in this than he did. I accept, he said clearly. Lady Nocturne nodded and turned to Seraphine. Princess, the Hayes brings you here, but the binding requires your word. Do you accept this union? Seraphine's jaw clenched. Her hands balled into fists at her sides, chains clinking with the movement. For a moment, Cashin thought she might refuse, might fight the magical compulsion until it tore her apart rather than submit to this humiliation. Then her eyes met his and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a recognition. They were both pawns in this game, both being sacrificed for powers and politics beyond their control. There was a strange solidarity in that, a shared defiance against the circumstances crushing them both. I accept, she said, and though her voice dripped with resentment, the words carried the ring of binding truth. The moment she spoke, the chains of moonlight shattered, dissolving into mist that evaporated before reaching the floor. Seraphine's wings spread fully for the first time, extending to their complete magnificent span, easily 15 feet across, dominating the space, casting Cashin entirely in their shadow. It was a display of freedom and power, a declaration that she might be bound by this marriage but not broken by it. Lady Nocturne raised the obsidian chalice. Blood calls to blood across the void between life and death. In this vessel is mixed the essence of binding, ancient magic that will tie your fates together for the span of Lord Thorn's natural life. You must both drink and in drinking accept all that this union entails. She offered the chalice first to Seraphine, who took it with both hands. The princess stared into its glowing depths for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, she lifted it to her lips and drank. The liquid seemed to glow brighter as it touched her, pulsing with crimson light that traveled down her throat and spread through her body like fire through dry wood. She gasped, her wings shuddering, and when she lowered the chalice her eyes had grown brighter, more intense. Your turn, mortal, she said, offering him the vessel with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Cashin took the chalice, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The moment they touched, he felt it, a jolt of connection, electric and profound, as if someone had just drawn a line directly between his soul and hers. Seraphine jerked back, her eyes wide with shock, clearly feeling the same thing. The liquid in the chalice smelled of copper and roses, of midnight and moonlight. It looked like blood but moved like water, catching the light in ways that defied physics. Cashin had survived poison attempts before. He knew the value of courage in the face of potential death. He lifted the chalice to his lips and drank. It tasted like everything and nothing, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water, like the sharp clarity of winter air, like the warmth of summer wine and the cold of winter snow simultaneously. It burned going down, a pleasant fire that spread through his chest and out to his limbs. His vision sharpened, colors becoming more vivid. His hearing intensified, picking up the whispers of the courtiers above, the breathing of the elders, the surprisingly rapid beat of Seraphine's heart. Then the pain hit. It felt as though someone had reached into his chest and was rewriting his essence letter by letter. He dropped to one knee, the empty chalice falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the marble. Through the haze of agony, he was dimly aware of Seraphine collapsing beside him, her wings wrapping around her body as she doubled over with a cry of anguish. The binding magic was doing something, making connections that shouldn't exist between vampire and human. He felt Seraphine's presence in his mind, not her thoughts but her emotions, her essence. Rage like a wildfire, pride like a mountain, fear like an abyss, and beneath it all, a loneliness so vast and ancient it made his heart ache with sympathy he didn't want to feel. And she could feel him too. He sensed her shock at the complexity she found there, at the depth of conviction, the carefully controlled fears, the love for his family that had driven him to accept this fate. For just a moment they were completely open to each other, all walls down, all pretense stripped away. Then the magic settled and the pain faded to a dull throb. Cashin found himself on his hands and knees, breathing hard, sweat dripping onto the marble. Beside him, Seraphine pushed herself upright, her wings trembling, her face paler than before, something he wouldn't have thought possible. "What?" she started, her voice shaking. "What was that?" Lady Nocturne looked troubled, more emotion showing on her ancient face than during the entire ceremony thus far. "The binding has taken a form I've never witnessed. You are bound, yes, but the connection runs deeper than anticipated. You will be able to sense each other, feel echoes of each other's emotions. Distance will be uncomfortable. Separation for too long may become painful. The magic has interpreted your marriage as a true partnership, not merely a political arrangement." "That's not possible," Seraphine said, pulling herself to her feet with visible effort. Her wings folded back against her shoulders, drawn tight. "He's human. The binding can't." "The binding doesn't care about our expectations," Lady Nocturne interrupted softly. "It simply is. You have made your vows, drunk from the chalice, accepted each other as partners. The magic has responded accordingly." Lord Malachar spoke from his throne, his ancient voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Perhaps this is for the best. A binding this strong will make it impossible for Princess Seraphine to harm Lord Thorn. Any pain she causes him will echo back to her, magnified. And it will ensure that both parties take this alliance seriously." Cashin pulled himself upright, his legs still shaky but holding. He could feel Seraphine beside him, not physically but as a presence at the edge of his consciousness, like peripheral vision but for emotions instead of sight. Her fury was a palpable thing, laced through with betrayal and fear. She turned to him and the look in her eyes was pure poison. "This is your fault," she hissed. "Whatever you did when you touched me, whatever human weakness infected the magic." "I didn't do anything," Cashin interrupted, his own temper finally fraying. "I drank from the same cup you did, followed the same ritual, and I'm just as trapped by this binding as you are. So perhaps instead of looking for someone to blame, we could focus on figuring out how to live with it." "Live with it?" Her laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. "You'll live with it for what, 50 years if you're lucky? Then you'll die and I'll be free again. I can endure 50 years. I've endured centuries of worse." 50 years, Cashin repeated quietly, and suddenly the weight of it hit him. 50 years bound to a creature who hated him, who was only kept from killing him by magical restraints, who would count every day of his life as a prison sentence. That does sound like a long time when you put it that way. Something in his tone must have penetrated her anger because she looked at him. Really looked, perhaps seeing him as something other than an obstacle or an enemy for the first time. What she found in his face seemed to surprise her because her expression softened fractionally. She started, then stopped, uncertainty flickering across her features. The binding between them carried a whisper of something that might have been regret. "The ceremony is complete," Lord Malachar announced, breaking the moment. Princess Seraphine, Lord Cashin, you are bound by blood and magic for the span of the human life. May this union serve the greater peace we all seek. He raised one ancient hand in a gesture of dismissal. Chambers have been prepared for you in the East Wing. You will remain in the Obsidian Court for 3 days as tradition dictates, then you may decide whether to live in vampire territory or return to the human lands. With that pronouncement, the elders rose as one and departed through doors that opened without anyone touching them, their dark robes flowing behind them like animate shadows. The courtiers in the gallery began to disperse, their whispered conversations creating a susurrus of sound like wind through dead leaves. Marcus approached cautiously, his hand still resting on his sword hilt. Cashin? Are you, all right? I'm married to a vampire princess who wants me dead, magically bound in ways no one fully understands, and currently standing in a court where I'm the only human in 1,000 miles. Cashin met his friend's concerned gaze and managed a strained smile. So I'd say I'm about as all right as can be expected. Seraphine stood slightly apart, her arms crossed, her wings mantled around her like a cloak. She was studying the floor with intense concentration, clearly trying to master whatever emotions were leaking through their bond. When she finally looked up, her eyes met Cashin's, and for just a moment, he saw past the fury and pride to the fear beneath. She was terrified. Not of him, he was mortal, weak, temporary. But of what this binding meant, of the loss of control, of having her eternal existence shackled to his brief candle of life. She was a vampire princess, a creature of immense power and pride, and in a single ceremony, she'd been rendered vulnerable in ways she'd never experienced in centuries of immortal life. And somehow, impossibly, through the binding that connected them, he felt the precise moment she realized he understood. Her eyes widened slightly and something in her expression shifted. Not to warmth, not even to acceptance, but to a wary recognition. They were enemies forced into alliance, strangers bound as intimately as lovers, and neither of them knew what came next. A servant appeared, a different vampire this time, male with the formal bearing of a royal attendant. Lord Thorn, Princess Seraphine, if you would follow me to your chambers. Seraphine moved first, her stride full of compressed violence, her wings rustling with agitation. Cashin followed, Marcus falling into step beside him, and together they walked deeper into the Obsidian Court, into the heart of vampire territory, into a future none of them could predict. Behind them, the throne room stood empty and vast, the moonlight through the remaining stained glass painting shifting patterns across the floor, crimson and silver, darkness and light, hopelessly intertwined. The east wing of the Obsidian Court was a study in controlled Gothic opulence. Unlike the austere grandeur of the throne room, these corridors breathed with a kind of dark intimacy, walls covered in deep burgundy and midnight blue tapestries depicting hunts and balls and scenes from vampire history, sconces holding actual flames that burned without consuming their candles, and everywhere roses. Not the cheerful blooms of daylight gardens, but night roses, deep crimson petals almost black at their hearts, their fragrance heavy and intoxicating, their thorns wickedly sharp. The servant led them through a labyrinth of turns that Cashin tried and failed to memorize. Marcus muttered something about breadcrumbs and fairy tales that might have been funny if their situation wasn't so grimly serious. Seraphine walked ahead of them, her wings held tight against her back, her posture rigid with barely controlled fury. Through their bond, Cashin could feel the storm of her emotions. Anger, yes, but also humiliation, fear, and a wild, desperate need to break something just to prove she still could. They stopped finally before a set of double doors carved with an intricate pattern of interwoven thorns and roses. The servant opened them with a small bow. Your chambers, my lord, my lady? Food and drink have been provided, though. He glanced at Cashin with something that might have been sympathy. The princess will require her own specific sustenance arrangements. I can arrange my own feeding, thank you, Seraphine said icily, sweeping past the servant into the room beyond. Cashin followed, Marcus close behind, and stopped just inside the doorway to take in what would apparently be his home for the next 3 days. The chamber was vast, larger than his bedroom in his family's estate, with soaring ceilings and those ever-present Gothic architectural flourishes. A massive canopied bed dominated one side, its dark wood posts carved with more of the thorn and rose motif, its coverings a rich crimson that looked black in shadow. A fireplace large enough to stand and occupied the far wall, flames already crackling though no one had been here to light them. Windows, thankfully covered with heavy drapes at the moment, lined the wall to the left. And everywhere, that same combination of luxury and subtle menace that seemed to characterize vampire aesthetics. But what caught Cashin's attention was the sitting area near the fire, where a table had been laid with food, human food. Roasted meat, fresh bread, cheese, wine, fruit. His stomach, which he'd been ignoring throughout the ceremony, suddenly reminded him that he'd eaten nothing since morning. The servant spoke of separate feeding arrangements, Marcus said quietly, his hand still on his sword. Cashin, you can't stay here alone with her. Not tonight. Not until we understand what this binding actually means. I'll be fine, Marcus. You won't, Seraphine said from across the room. She'd positioned herself near the windows as far from them as possible without actually leaving. Your friend is right. I'm hungry, I'm furious, and you smell? She stopped abruptly, a look of horror crossing her face. I smell? Cashin prompted, not sure he wanted to know the answer. Appealing, she finished quietly, the word clearly pulled from her against her will. Your blood, the human warmth of you, the binding has made it worse somehow. Normally humans are just food, necessary but no more interesting than wine is to you. But now, with this connection between us, she made a frustrated gesture, her wings rustling, you're singing to my instincts. Every predatory urge I have is fixated on you, and the binding won't even let me act on it because harming you would harm me. The admission clearly cost her pride dearly. She turned away, facing the draped windows, her shoulders tight with tension. Marcus's grip on his sword tightened. Then he definitely can't stay here. No, Cashin said, making his decision. Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but this is exactly the situation we knew we'd face. The binding apparently protects me from the most immediate danger. And if Seraphine and I are going to survive 50 years of this marriage, the number still felt surreal. We need to start learning how to coexist. That doesn't happen with you standing guard between us with a sword. It also doesn't happen if she loses control and you die on your wedding night, Marcus shot back. I won't lose control, Seraphine said, still not turning around. I've existed for 3 centuries. I've mastered hunger that would drive younger vampires to madness. I've endured trials your mortal mind can't begin to imagine. I think I can manage not to eat my husband, however tempting he might smell. The last part was delivered with such bitter sarcasm that it almost made Cashin smile. Almost. Marcus, Cashin said gently, putting a hand on his friend's shoulder, go get some rest. The vampires have provided chambers for you in the guest wing. We'll reconvene in the morning and I swear to you, I'll still be alive. You can't know that. No, Cashin agreed. But I'm choosing to trust it anyway. That's what faith is, old friend. A decision to believe despite uncertainty. Marcus looked between them, his oldest friend and the vampire princess who was now legally bound to him. Finally, he released his sword hilt and pulled Cashin into a quick, fierce embrace. If you die, he muttered, I'm going to be extremely annoyed with you. Noted. Marcus pulled back, gave Seraphine one last warning look that she completely ignored, and left, the doors closing behind him with a soft click that sounded very much like finality. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken tension. Cashin moved to the table and began preparing a plate of food, suddenly ravenous. Seraphine remained by the windows, a statue carved from moonlight and pride. You should eat, he said after a few moments. Your friend was right to be concerned, and hunger won't help your self-control. How thoughtful, she replied acidly. Unfortunately, the kitchens here are not prepared to serve what I require on such short notice. I'll need to arrange for, she paused, clearly uncomfortable, appropriate sustenance to be brought from the stores. Cashin took a bite of bread, chewing slowly while he considered his next words carefully. The binding, he finally said, works both ways, doesn't it? I can feel your emotions somewhat, which means you can feel mine. Unfortunately. Then you know I'm not your enemy. You can feel that I don't want this situation any more than you do, that I'm as trapped by circumstances as you are. She turned then, her crimson eyes finding his across the room. I can feel that you believe that. But belief and reality are not always aligned. You're human. You benefit from this arrangement. You get a vampire princess as a wife, access to our magic and influence, a significant political alliance. Meanwhile, I lose my freedom, my dignity, and 50 years of my immortal life. You're right, Cashin said simply. It's not fair. The power imbalance here is absurd. You're essentially immortal, incredibly powerful, and forced to bind yourself to someone who will die in what is, to you, a brief moment. I can't make that fair. But I can try to make it bearable. How generous, she said, but some of the venom had leaked out of her tone. She moved away from the windows, drifting closer to the fire with a grace that made walking seem like flying. Tell me something, Lord Cashin Thorne. Why did you agree to this? And don't give me the political speech about alliances and peace. Through this binding, I can feel there's more to it than duty. Cashin set down his food, no longer hungry. My brother has 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. The youngest is 5. When I look at her, I see a future full of possibility. She wants to be a scholar, to travel to the great universities, to learn everything the world has to teach. But that future only exists if there's peace, if the alliances hold, if creatures that lurk beyond vampire territories don't come pouring through because the treaty collapsed. He met Seraphine's eyes. I agreed to this marriage so she can have that future. So all the children in the Eastern Kingdoms can have futures instead of just survival. Seraphine stared at him, and through their bond, he felt her surprise and something else, a reluctant understanding. You love them, she said quietly. Your family. It's not just duty. You would actually die for them. In a heartbeat. She moved closer, drawn by curiosity or perhaps by the binding itself. In the firelight, her beauty was almost painful to look at, too perfect, too otherworldly, like staring at a work of art that shouldn't exist in 3 dimensions. I had a brother once, she said softly. 2 centuries ago. He challenged a vampire lord over territory and lost. I held him while he died, or rather while he faded, because vampires don't die easily. It took weeks. He was conscious for most of it, unable to heal, unable to end it. I understand love that would drive you to sacrifice anything. Her voice caught. I haven't felt it in so long. When you're immortal, caring for others becomes dangerous. Everyone you love who isn't vampire will wither and die. And even other vampires can be taken from you. Eventually you learn to stop caring so much. It's safer. The vulnerability in her admission shocked him. This was the same creature who'd faced the Elder Council with pure defiance, who'd mocked him in front of the assembled court. Now, alone with him in the firelight, with a binding between them making lies impossible, she was showing him the loneliness beneath the pride. I'm sorry, he said. About your brother. She waved a hand dismissively, but he felt the grief that pulsed through their connection. It was a long time ago. I've mourned him already. She sat down in the chair across from him, not quite at the table, but close enough that he could have reached out and touched her if he'd been foolish enough to try. This binding is going to make lying to each other difficult, isn't it? Apparently. How irritating. But there was a ghost of a smile on her lips as she said it. I suppose we'll have to find other ways to maintain privacy. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the crackling fire the only sound. Cashin resumed eating, his hunger returning now that the tension had eased slightly. Seraphine watched him with an expression that was part curiosity, part fascination, as if he were some exotic creature she was studying. You really do smell appealing, she finally said, as if the observation had been bothering her. It's not just hunger. The binding has made your scent, your essence, attractive to me in ways that are deeply inconvenient. I'll try not to take that as a compliment. You should. Vampires rarely find humans appealing beyond their utility as food. But you, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense. You're different. Maybe it's the binding. Maybe it's something about you specifically. Either way, it's going to make this arrangement even more complicated than anticipated. Cashin set down his wine glass carefully. Seraphine, I need you to understand something. I know the marriage ceremony has bound us legally and magically, but I have no intention of forcing any kind of intimacy you don't want. Despite what some humans might think about vampires, I don't consider you property or a prize. You're a person, an incredibly powerful, terrifying person who could kill me in creative ways I probably can't even imagine, but still a person. Whatever this marriage becomes, it will only be what we both agree to. She blinked at him, clearly not expecting that speech. Through their bond, he felt a wave of confusion, quickly followed by something that might have been respect. That's, she paused, seeming to struggle with the words, surprisingly decent of you. Most humans in your position would feel entitled to, she gestured vaguely, consummate the marriage. Assert dominance. Make demands. Most humans in my position probably have more pride than sense, Cashin replied. I'd rather survive the next 50 years than die proving a point in the first week. She laughed, actually laughed, clear and genuine, and the sound transformed her face completely. For a moment she looked young despite her centuries, almost carefree. I think I might actually like you, Lord Thorn. Against all reason and my better judgment, you're proving to be tolerable company. High praise from a vampire princess. The highest, she assured him with mock solemnity. Then her expression grew serious again. But I do need to feed. So, the hunger is, she pressed a hand to her chest. It's becoming difficult to ignore, especially with you sitting so close, smelling like. She stopped, shaking her head. I need to make arrangements. Then make them, Cashin said. I'm not going anywhere. Seraphine rose from her chair with fluid grace and moved to a bell pull near the door. A moment later, the servant from before appeared with supernatural speed. She spoke to him in a language Cashin didn't recognize, something old and sibilant, full of sounds human throats weren't designed to make. The servant nodded and disappeared. He'll bring me what I need from the stores, she explained, returning to stand near the fire. Preserved blood. It's not as satisfying as fresh feeding, but it will suffice for tonight. In the future I'll need to arrange for proper donors, but that's a conversation for when we're both less exhausted. Cashin nodded, trying not to think too hard about the mechanics of vampire feeding. Whatever you need. The servant returned in less than 5 minutes with a crystal decanter filled with liquid that gleamed crimson in the firelight. He bowed and departed without a word. Seraphine took the decanter with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly, the first sign of physical weakness Cashin had seen from her. She moved back to her chair and raised the decanter to her lips, hesitating for just a moment. You may want to look away. Vampires feeding is not. It's considered intimate, private. Watching might be uncomfortable. We're married, Cashin said. Bound in ways that let us feel each other's emotions. I think we're past the point of polite privacy. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. As you wish. She drank, and Cashin understood immediately why she'd warned him. It wasn't grotesque exactly, but it was profoundly other. Watching her throat work as she swallowed, seeing the way her eyes brightened with each mouthful, noticing how her entire body seemed to come alive, to glow with internal fire as the blood entered her system. Her wings unfurled slightly, rustling with satisfaction, and a soft sound, almost a purr, escaped her throat. Through their bond, he felt her hunger being satisfied, the desperate edge of need softening into contentment. But he also felt something else, a sensual pleasure in the feeding, an almost intoxicating satisfaction that made his own pulse quicken in response. She finished and lowered the decanter, her eyes glowing brighter than before, her cheeks flushed with color that hadn't been there minutes ago. She looked vital now, fully alive in a way that made her previous demeanor seem like a shadow. And she was staring at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. The binding, she said, her voice slightly rough. You felt that. It wasn't a question. Yes. That's, she set the decanter down with hands that were perfectly steady now, that's going to be a problem. Feeding is private, intimate for vampires. The fact that you can feel it through our bond, that my satisfaction becomes yours, she stood abruptly, moving to put the chair between them, that's a level of connection I never anticipated. Cashin stood as well, though he made no move to approach her. Seraphine, don't, she interrupted, holding up one hand. Don't apologize, don't try to comfort me, don't say anything kind or understanding right now. I'm barely holding on to my composure as it is." Her wings were trembling, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I have spent 3 centuries in complete control of myself, of my hungers and needs and desires. And now, in one night, I'm bound to a human who can feel my emotions, whose scent drives my instincts wild, who shows me kindness when I expected cruelty, and who," she stopped, seemed to be fighting with herself, "and who is far more attractive than I want to admit." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest and impossible to take back. Through their bond, Cashin felt the truth of it. Her confusion, her unwilling attraction, her fury at herself for feeling anything positive toward him at all. "This isn't what either of us wanted," he said carefully. "But we're here, bound together, and apparently the magic has decided we're supposed to actually connect rather than just tolerate each other. We can fight it, spend the next 50 years making both of us miserable. Or," he paused, choosing his words with extreme care, "we can accept that this situation is strange and complicated and see where it leads." "Where it leads?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It leads to me watching you age and die while I remain unchanged. It leads to me caring about someone whose life is a fraction of my existence. It leads to pain, Lord Thorn. The same pain I swore never to feel again after my brother died." "Maybe," Cashin agreed. "But it might also lead somewhere better than either of us can imagine right now. And isn't a chance at something good worth the risk of eventual pain?" She stared at him across the distance she'd deliberately created, her crimson eyes reflecting firelight and something else. Hope, perhaps, or fear, or both mixed together in equal measure. "You're going to be trouble?" she said finally, quietly. "I can already tell." "Probably." A smile ghosted across her lips. "The bed is large enough for both of us, though I warn you, I don't sleep as humans do. I rest but lightly, and I'll be aware if you move. I'll try not to kick." She laughed again, that same surprising, genuine sound, and some of the tension drained from the room. They prepared for sleep in oddly domestic silence. Cashin removed his formal coat and boots. Seraphine unfastened her elaborate crown and set it aside, then began the complex process of removing the Gothic gown, which apparently required more hooks and laces than seemed architecturally necessary. "Would you?" she started, then stopped, pride warring with practicality. "Need help?" Cashin offered. "The laces in back are difficult to reach," she admitted grudgingly. He approached slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. She turned her back to him, her wings held carefully out of the way, and he found himself facing an expanse of pale skin bisected by black laces. His fingers were steady as he worked, despite his awareness of how intimate this was, standing close enough to feel her body heat, to smell that night-blooming flower scent, to see the delicate structure of her wings where they emerged from her shoulder blades. "Thank you," she said quietly when he'd finished. She disappeared behind a screen in the corner and emerged a few minutes later wearing a simple dark gown that was clearly meant for sleeping. Still elegant, still Gothic in its styling, but infinitely more practical than the elaborate dress. Her hair was loose now, falling in waves down her back, and without the crown and formal attire, she looked younger, less intimidating. She looked, Cashin realized with some surprise, beautiful in an entirely human way. They approached the bed from opposite sides, and for a moment, the absurdity of the situation struck them both. A vampire princess and a human lord, forced into marriage, about to share a bed on their wedding night under the strangest circumstances imaginable. "This is ridiculous," Seraphine said. "Completely. If anyone had told me this morning that I'd be doing this tonight." "You would have killed them?" "Slowly and creatively," she confirmed, but she was smiling as she said it. They settled into the bed, Cashin on one side, Seraphine on the other, a careful distance between them. The mattress was impossibly comfortable, the sheets cool silk against skin. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, casting the room in gentle shadow. "Cashin?" Seraphine's voice came soft through the darkness. "Yes. Thank you. For earlier. For being," she paused, searching for the word, "decent. It's more than I expected." "You're welcome." Silence fell, comfortable now, the kind of quiet that spoke of truce rather than tension. Cashin felt himself drifting towards sleep, exhaustion from the long day finally catching up with him. Through the bond, he could sense Seraphine entering her own rest state. Not sleep, but something close, a quieting of her thoughts and emotions. Just as he was about to slip under completely, he felt something through their connection. A whisper of warmth, of gratitude, of something that might have been the first fragile thread of affection. His last conscious thought was that perhaps, against all odds, this strange marriage might actually have a chance of becoming something real. Cashin woke to the peculiar sensation of being watched. Years of military training had him cataloging his surroundings before opening his eyes. The soft bed beneath him, the silk sheets tangled around his legs, the faint smell of roses and something else, something cold and wild. Memory returned in a rush. The vampire court, the binding ceremony, the wedding to a creature who should have been myth and legend. He opened his eyes to find Seraphine sitting in the chair by the fire, which had been rebuilt sometime during the night. She was watching him with an expression of intense concentration, her crimson eyes tracking every breath he took, every slight movement. In the pre-dawn darkness, for the heavy curtains kept out even the suggestion of approaching daylight, she seemed to glow faintly as if her skin held its own illumination. "How long have you been watching me?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "An hour. Perhaps 2. She tilted her head slightly, studying him like a particularly interesting specimen. "You make sounds in your sleep. Small noises as if you're dreaming but not peacefully. And your heart rate fluctuates, faster during what I assume are nightmares, slower during calmer dreams. Fascinating. I've never paid such close attention to human sleep patterns before." Cashin sat up, pushing hair out of his eyes. "That's only slightly disturbing." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "I could have done worse. I could have counted your breaths or monitored your pulse by placing my hand over your heart. I was tempted, but I thought that might alarm you upon waking." Thoughtful. "I thought so." He swung his legs out of bed, noting that someone, probably the servant, had left fresh clothes folded on a nearby table. Black again because apparently, vampires had strong opinions about appropriate coloring for formal wear. "What happens today? Are there more ceremonies? Additional rituals?" "Nothing so dramatic." Seraphine stood, moving to the windows. Her hand hovered over the drape's edge but didn't pull it back. "The 3 days following a vampire wedding are meant for the couple to," she paused, choosing words carefully, "bond. To establish the parameters of their relationship. Traditionally, it's when physical consummation occurs, when power dynamics are settled, when they determine how their shared existence will function. And since our situation is anything but traditional, we adapt." She finally pulled the drape aside, but only by a few inches, letting in a sliver of pre-dawn light that was still more darkness than illumination. "The sun will rise soon. I'll need to retreat deeper into the castle, to rooms where daylight never reaches. You're free to explore the court, to spend time with your friend Marcus, to do whatever humans do during daylight hours. We'll reconvene at dusk." There was something in her tone, a careful neutrality that the binding revealed as forced. Underneath it, Cashin sensed reluctance, almost loneliness at the thought of separation. "Or," he said carefully, "I could come with you." She turned sharply, surprise clear on her face. "Into the deep chambers? You'd willingly retreat from daylight to spend time in the windowless depths where vampires hide from the sun? We're supposed to be bonding, establishing parameters. Hard to do that if we're apart all day." He stood, moving closer but maintaining respectful distance. "Besides, through this binding, I suspect separation will be uncomfortable for both of us. May as well find out the limits while we're still in the safety of the court." Seraphine stared at him, and through their connection he felt a tumult of emotion. Disbelief, a warm pleasure she was trying to suppress, confusion about why a human would choose her company over daylight freedom. "You're very strange," she finally said. "Most humans fear the deep places of vampire dwellings. There's old magic down there and darkness that feels alive. Most humans aren't married to vampire princesses." "True." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "Very well. but you'll need warmer clothes. The deep chambers are cold, we don't feel it but you will. And you'll need food because the kitchens down there are not designed for human needs. They spent the next hour in oddly domestic preparation. Servants appeared with additional clothing, heavy wool and fur-lined items that seemed excessive until Cashin remembered they were discussing chambers deep underground where sunlight had never penetrated. Food was packed in a basket that seemed too small to hold the amount they kept placing in it, which made Cashin suspect magical augmentation, but he decided not to ask. Marcus arrived just as they were preparing to depart, his expression hovering between relief at seeing Cashin alive and concern about whatever was happening now. You survived the night. I did. And now you're going? Marcus looked at the heavy clothing, the food basket. Somewhere? The deep chambers, Seraphine supplied, seemingly amused by Marcus's barely concealed alarm. Your friend has decided that marital bonding requires spending the day together, even if it means retreating from sunlight. Marcus struggled with how to phrase his thoughts diplomatically, an unexpected choice. I'm full of those lately, Cashin said. We'll be back by tonight. Try not to start any diplomatic incidents while I'm gone. That's usually your specialty, not mine. But Marcus pulled him aside, lowering his voice. Are you sure about this? Going deeper into their territory, into places humans aren't meant to see. No, Cashin admitted. But I don't think separation is a good idea. The binding, I can already feel it. Being apart from her is uncomfortable, like an itch I can't scratch. And if we're going to make this work, we need to actually spend time together, learn about each other. Marcus looked past him to where Seraphine waited by the door, her wings folded, her expression carefully neutral. You like her, he said quietly, a note of wonder in his voice. Already. After one night. Cashin started to protest, then stopped. Through the binding, he could feel his own emotions reflected back to him by Seraphine's presence. Curiosity, yes. Respect, certainly. And beneath it, the first stirrings of something more, something he hadn't expected to feel. It's complicated. It always is. Marcus gripped his shoulder. Be careful down there. And if you don't return by nightfall, I'm coming after you, vampire protocol be damned. I'd expect nothing less. Seraphine led him through the castle, down corridors that grew progressively older, stones rougher, architecture more ancient. They passed from the Gothic elegance of the newer sections into passages carved directly from rock, where the walls gleamed with dampness and the air grew noticeably cooler. Other vampires passed them occasionally, courtiers and servants who bowed to Seraphine with varying degrees of respect and curiosity, their eyes lingering on Cashin with expressions he couldn't quite read. They're wondering why you're still alive, Seraphine commented, clearly noticing his discomfort. And why I'm taking you to the deep chambers. Those areas are private, restricted. Taking a human there is, she paused. It implies a level of trust and acceptance that most vampires wouldn't extend to a forced spouse after one night. And yet you're doing it. And yet I'm doing it, she agreed, sounding slightly puzzled by her own actions. The binding, I think. It makes your presence comfortable in ways I didn't anticipate. When we were apart for those few hours while I arranged today's preparations, I felt, she made a frustrated gesture, incomplete. As if part of me was missing. It's deeply annoying. I felt the same, Cashin admitted. Like an absence where something should have been. She glanced at him, and something in her expression softened. I suppose we're well and truly bound then. The magic has decided we're meant to be a matched pair. They descended a final spiral staircase, the steps worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and emerged into a vast underground chamber that took Cashin's breath away. It was nothing like the oppressive darkness he'd expected. Instead, the space was lit by bioluminescent fungi growing in patterns across the walls and ceiling, blues and greens and soft purples that created an otherworldly twilight. Underground streams ran through channels carved into the floor, their water clear as crystal, and despite being far below ground, the air felt fresh, almost alive. Welcome to the Heart Chambers, Seraphine said softly. The oldest part of the obsidian court, where the original vampires made their home thousands of years ago. We've expanded upward over the centuries, but this is where we retreat during the day, where we feel safest. Vampires lounged throughout the chamber, some on carved stone benches, others on elaborate cushions, a few simply reclining on the stone floor itself. They were in various states of rest, some in that peculiar vampire sleep but not sleep, others engaged in quiet conversation. All of them looked up as Seraphine and Cassian entered, curiosity and surprise evident on their pale faces. "Princess," a female vampire with elaborate braids called out, "you've brought your human to sanctuary? How progressive. How reckless," another voice countered, this one male older. "He's barely bound to you for a day. What if he can't be trusted with our secrets?" Seraphine's wings spread slightly, not fully but enough to make her appear larger, more commanding. "Lord Cassian Thorn is my husband, bound to me by magic and elder decree. What I share with him is my decision, not yours. If any have objections, they may take it up with the council." The implied threat was clear. Challenging her decision meant challenging the elders who had arranged this marriage. The chamber fell silent, though Cassian could feel the weight of their gazes, measuring him, judging him. Seraphine led him to a section of the chamber that was more secluded, partially screened by natural stone formations. A low platform held cushions and furs, creating a comfortable space that was somehow both primitive and luxurious. She settled onto the cushions with effortless grace, her wings spreading behind her as she reclined. "Sit," she invited. "We have hours until sunset. We might as well use them productively." Cassian sat, arranging the food basket within reach. The stone was indeed cold beneath him, even through the cushions and furs, but not unbearably so. "What did you have in mind?" "Information exchange." She shifted, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them, a pose that made her look remarkably young and vulnerable. "If we're going to be bound for 50 years, we should probably know more about each other than what we've learned through the binding's emotional echoes. So, tell me about your life. Your family, your history, the choices that led you to accept this marriage." And so he did. Cassian found himself talking in ways he rarely did, about growing up as the second son, always in his brother's shadow but loved none the less for it. About discovering his talent for warfare and diplomacy, about the border wars and the things he'd seen there that still haunted his dreams. About his nieces and nephew, who he loved with a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. About his father's failing health and his mother's quiet strength, about the responsibility he felt to protect his family's future even if it meant sacrificing his own. Seraphine listened intently, asking questions that demonstrated she was truly paying attention, not just making polite conversation. And through their bond, he could feel her genuine interest, her growing understanding of what drove him. When he finally fell silent, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd shared. "You're driven by love," she finally said. "Everything you've done, every sacrifice, it all comes back to protecting those you care about. That's," she paused, seeming to struggle with the word, "admirable. Exhausting, certainly, and probably painful in the long run. But admirable. What about you?" Cassian asked. "You've lived 3 centuries. That's more history than I can probably comprehend. But tell me something. What was it like before? Before the treaty, before vampires retreated into shadows?" Her expression grew distant, eyes focusing on something only she could see. "Glorious," she said softly. "And terrible. We were predators, true apex creatures. Humans feared us, worshipped us, offered sacrifices to appease us. We had power beyond measure, influence that shaped kingdoms. But," her voice dropped, "it was also lonely. So lonely. Every human we might have cared for died in what felt like heartbeats. Every mortal friend became dust while we remained. And we fought constantly among ourselves, power struggles, territorial disputes, old grudges that turned into centuries-long feuds. The treaty brought peace, but it also brought insignificance. We survive now, but we don't truly live. Is that why you fed on Lord Blackthorn's servants? Not just spite, but a desire to feel powerful again?" She turned to him sharply, but through their bond, he felt her surprise that he'd understood. "Perhaps," she admitted. "The Elder Council wants us to hide, to diminish ourselves, To pretend we're content with scraps of influence in a world that belongs to humans now. But I remember when we were magnificent. I remember when we were feared and respected. Bowing and scraping to preserve peace feels like betraying what we are. But peace also means survival, Cashin pointed out gently. You said it yourself, you're few and humans are many. Pride is valuable, but life is more valuable still. Is it? She challenged. What's the point of immortality if we spend it cowering? What's the value of eternal life if we live it in shadows of our former glory? The value, Cashin said, is in what you choose to do with it. You have centuries ahead of you. Centuries to learn, to create, to find new purposes. Yes, you've lost some of what you were. But that doesn't mean you can't find something new to be. She stared at him, and through their bond, he felt the impact of his words, how they resonated with doubts she'd carried for decades but never voiced. You have an answer for everything, don't you? Not everything. But I'm good at thinking through problems. It's what kept me alive in the border wars. Tell me about them, she said suddenly. The border wars. What horrors did you face there? So he told her about the creatures that had come from the wastes beyond vampire territory, things that were neither vampire nor human, neither truly alive nor properly dead. He described the battles fought in darkness because those creatures feared light, the friends he'd lost, the terrible decisions he'd had to make about who could be saved and who had to be left behind. He talked about the nightmares that still woke him sometimes, the weight of command, the burden of being responsible for so many lives. Seraphine listened, and when he finished, she reached out and touched his hand, the first time she'd voluntarily made physical contact with him. Her skin was cool, not cold, her fingers delicate but strong. You've seen real horror, she said quietly. And you're still kind. That's rare. Most people who see what you've seen become hard, cruel. But you've somehow remained decent. I've had good examples, Cashin replied, very aware of her hand on his but not pulling away. And I've seen what cruelty does, to enemies and to the people who practice it. I prefer to stay human in the best sense of that word. Human, she repeated, and her smile was sad. Yes, you are very human. Mortal and limited and temporary. And somehow that makes you more precious than immortality. They sat in comfortable silence, her hand still resting on his, the bond between them humming with contentment. Around them, the heart chamber continued its timeless existence. Vampires resting, water flowing, bioluminescent light painting everything in shades of blue and green. Can I ask you something potentially offensive? Cashin ventured after a while. Now I'm intrigued. Ask. What does it feel like? Being a vampire. The immortality, the power, the need for blood. I'm trying to understand you, and I realize I know almost nothing about what your existence actually feels like. Seraphine considered the question, her thumb absently stroking the back of his hand, a gesture she didn't seem aware of making. It feels like being constantly in between states. Not alive in the way humans are, but not dead either. We don't breathe, or rather we do, but we don't need to. Our hearts beat once per minute, enough to circulate blood but not like the constant rhythm of human life. We can feel temperature but it doesn't affect us. We can taste food but it doesn't nourish us. We exist in this strange twilight space between life and death, powerful but disconnected. That sounds lonely. It is, she admitted. So lonely. Humans fear us, other vampires are potential rivals, and immortality means watching everything change while you stay the same. Do you know what it's like to return to a city you knew well, only to find it completely transformed? Buildings you remember are gone, people are long dead, even the language has shifted. You become a ghost, watching the living world move on without you. Is that why vampires stay in places like this? So you have something constant? Partially. But also because we need darkness. Sunlight won't kill us instantly, that's a myth. But it weakens us terribly, burns our skin, makes us sluggish and pained. Moonlight is when we're strongest, when we feel most alive. She glanced up at the ceiling of stone, beyond which the sun was presumably rising. Right now, even down here, I can feel it. The weight of daylight pressing down, making me tired in ways I never am at night. Then rest, Cashin suggested. I'll keep watch. She looked at him skeptically. Keep watch against what? We're in the safest place in the vampire kingdom. Habit from military life. Someone should always be watching. And besides, he smiled, this way I can stare at you the way you stared at me this morning. She laughed, that clear genuine sound that was becoming his favorite noise. Fair enough. She shifted, reclining back against the cushions, her wings spreading beneath her like a dark blanket. Wake me if anything interesting happens. Define interesting in a vampire court. Someone attempting assassination, an elder council summons, or your friend Marcus doing something diplomatically disastrous. Her eyes were already closing, her body relaxing into rest. Anything less can wait. Cashin watched her settle into that strange vampire rest state, not quite asleep but not quite awake either. Her breathing, already so slow as to be nearly imperceptible, became even more shallow. Her heart rate dropped to that once-per-minute rhythm he'd learned to listen for. And her wings, those magnificent structures, continued to move slightly, adjusting themselves with tiny micro-movements as if they had their own awareness. Through their bond, he could feel her consciousness dimming, pulling back into whatever place vampires went when they rested. But there was a thread of connection still there, a awareness of his presence that seemed to comfort her. As he watched, some of the tension left her face, the constant wariness she carried easing away. She was beautiful like this, not in the devastating, dangerous way she appeared at court, but in a softer, more vulnerable manner. Her face, normally set in expressions of pride or contempt or calculation, was peaceful. She looked young despite her centuries. She looked almost human. I think I'm in trouble, Cashin murmured to himself, knowing she couldn't hear him in this state. I'm already starting to care about you and we've known each other less than a day. But the binding didn't lie and through it he recognized the truth. He was attracted to her, yes, how could he not be? But more than that, he respected her strength, was intrigued by her complexity, was moved by the loneliness he sensed beneath her pride. She was a puzzle he wanted to solve, a person he wanted to know, and if he wasn't careful she would become someone he genuinely loved. And that, as she'd warned him, would end in pain when his mortal life eventually concluded. But then again, Cashin thought as he settled in to watch over her rest, what was life without risk? What was love without the possibility of loss? He'd rather have 50 years of something real with her than a lifetime of safe, distant coexistence. He just had to convince her of the same. Seraphine woke to the sensation of being watched. Again, but this time it felt different. There was no discomfort in it, no sense of threat. Instead she felt cherished. As if the person watching her was guarding something precious. She opened her eyes to find Cashin exactly where he'd been when she fell into rest, sitting upright and alert, his focus absolute. The food basket was mostly empty, suggesting he'd eaten while she rested. The bioluminescent light in the heart chamber had shifted slightly in color, indicating hours had passed. You actually kept watch, she said, surprised despite herself. I said I would. He stretched, his spine making small popping sounds that made her wince in sympathy. And I've been working on a theory. A theory? About the binding. He shifted to face her more directly. Every time we touch, it gets stronger, or rather, the connection becomes clearer. When you took my hand earlier, I could feel your emotions more precisely, could almost hear your thoughts. And I think, he paused, choosing words carefully, I think the binding is trying to encourage us toward physical contact, toward actual intimacy. Seraphine sat up, her wings rustling as they adjusted. That's a disturbing thought. You're suggesting the magic has its own agenda? All magic does, doesn't it? The elders said the binding took an unexpected form. Maybe it's trying to complete itself, to establish the full connection it thinks should exist between married partners. She considered this, testing the theory against her own observations. That would explain why your presence is so comfortable, why separation felt wrong. The binding wants us close, wants us touching, wants us... She stopped, uncomfortable with where that logic led. Wants us to be truly married, Cashin finished gently. Not just legally bound but actually connected. I don't like being manipulated by magic, Seraphine said flatly. I especially don't like being pushed toward intimacy I haven't chosen. Neither do I. Cashin held up his hands in a placating gesture. But understanding the magic doesn't mean surrendering to it. We can acknowledge what the binding wants while still making our own choices about how to respond. Knowledge is power, right? She studied him, impressed again by his pragmatic approach. Lesser men would have tried to use the binding's push toward intimacy to their advantage, would have insisted it meant she should submit to his advances. Instead, he was giving her information and leaving the choice with her. "You're too reasonable," she complained without heat. "It makes being angry at you very difficult. I live to frustrate your expectations." She stood, stretching her wings to their full span, a luxurious movement that made several other vampires in the chamber look over with interest. "The day must be ending. I can feel it, the weight lifting, the strength returning. We should return to our chambers before the evening activities begin." "What evening activities?" "Court intrigue mostly. Vampires gathering to gossip, to scheme, to demonstrate their power and influence. Tonight will be particularly busy. Everyone will want to see the newly married couple, to assess whether this alliance will hold or collapse spectacularly." Cashin groaned. "I knew there would be more politics. Welcome to vampire society, husband. Everything is politics." They made their way back through the corridors, reversing their earlier path. As they climbed, Seraphine could feel the sunset approaching, power returning to her limbs, awareness sharpening, the sluggish weight of daylight finally releasing its hold. By the time they reached their chambers, she felt fully herself again, vital and strong. Marcus was waiting in the corridor outside their doors, relief evident on his face when he saw Cashin. "You survived the deep chambers too. At this rate, you'll live to see the full 3 days. Have faith, Marcus. I'm learning to navigate vampire politics. That's what worries me. You're good at it." Marcus nodded to Seraphine with careful respect. "Princess, I trust my friend wasn't too much trouble during the day?" "Surprisingly tolerable," Seraphine replied, and was amused by Cashin's mock-hurt expression. "He kept watch while I rested and only ate half the food supplies we brought. In my defense, I was hungry." "Humans usually are," she said dryly. "It's one of your more predictable traits." Marcus looked between them, something like wonder crossing his face. "You're bantering. You're actually getting along." "Shocking, isn't it?" Cashin said. "Almost as if we're both reasonable people trapped in an unreasonable situation and trying to make the best of it." The three of them entered the chambers, where servants had clearly been busy during their absence. Fresh flowers, the dark roses, always the roses, had been arranged throughout the room. The fire had been rebuilt. The bed had been remade with fresh linens. And laid out on the bed was an elaborate gown in deep burgundy, clearly meant for Seraphine to wear to tonight's court gathering. She picked it up, examining the craftsmanship. Vampire tailors were unparalleled. They had centuries to perfect their skills. This gown would fit her perfectly, would move with her body as if it were alive itself. But it also represented what was expected of her tonight, to appear before the court as the properly married princess, subdued and bound, a lesson to others who might challenge elder authority. "I'm expected to dress up and parade around like a trophy," she said, not bothering to hide her resentment. "To demonstrate that even vampire royalty can be tamed through magical binding and political necessity." "Or," Cashin suggested quietly, "you could see it as an opportunity to demonstrate that you're still Princess Seraphine Morganthia, that marriage hasn't diminished you, and that anyone who mistakes binding for breaking is going to learn a painful lesson." She turned to look at him, surprised. "You're suggesting I go out there and prove my strength?" "I'm suggesting you be exactly who you are, powerful, proud, and absolutely terrifying when you choose to be. Let them see that marriage to a human hasn't changed that. Let them see that we're a partnership, not a conquest." Through their bond she felt his absolute sincerity. He wasn't trying to control her or manage her for political advantage. He genuinely wanted her to maintain her power, to remain herself. It was so unexpected from a human husband that for a moment she couldn't formulate a response. "That's," she started, then paused, trying to articulate what she felt. "That's not how marriages usually work. The husband asserts dominance, the wife submits or at least presents that appearance publicly. You're suggesting the opposite." "I'm suggesting equality," Cashin corrected. You're more powerful than me, that's simple fact. You'll outlive me by centuries. Pretending otherwise would be absurd. So why not acknowledge reality and build something honest instead? Marcus cleared his throat. I'm going to leave you two to prepare for tonight. Cassian, try not to start any revolutions in vampire gender politics before dinner. After Marcus left, Seraphine moved to the screen to change, but found herself hesitating. She turned back to Cassian. Earlier you had a theory about the binding and physical contact. Would you, the words felt strange in her mouth, would you be willing to test it? To see if increased contact does strengthen the connection. He went very still, careful in a way that suggested he was trying not to spook her. What did you have in mind? Nothing dramatic, she said quickly. Just touch. Deliberate, voluntary contact. To see what happens when we're both willing participants rather than forced by circumstance. Cassian stood slowly and crossed to where she stood by the screen. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough to touch but not touching, his eyes searching her face. Are you sure? We don't have to test anything. We can just continue as we have been. I want to understand what we're dealing with. And, she admitted quietly, I want to know if the attraction I'm feeling is genuine or just magical manipulation. The binding makes lying about emotions difficult, but it doesn't necessarily make those emotions real versus magically induced. That's fair. He held out his hand, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. We'll start simple. Take my hand and we'll both pay attention to what we feel through the binding. Seraphine looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. This was a choice, a conscious decision to increase their connection, to potentially open herself to more vulnerability. Every instinct she developed over 3 centuries screamed warnings about caring too much, about allowing closeness that could lead to pain. But beneath the fear was curiosity, and a longing she tried to ignore. When was the last time someone had touched her with tenderness? When had she last allowed herself to be vulnerable with another person? She placed her hand in his. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The binding between them flared with sudden intensity, and Seraphine gasped as sensation flooded through her. Cassian's warmth, both physical and emotional, his attraction to her that he'd been carefully controlling, his growing affection that was deeper than she'd realized, his determination to make this strange marriage work, his fear that he was already falling for someone he'd known less than 2 days. And through the binding she knew he was feeling her responses. Her surprise at the intensity of the connection, her unwilling pleasure at his touch, her terror at how much she wanted this contact, her desire for more that she'd been trying to suppress. This is, she started but couldn't finish the sentence. Intense, Cassian completed, his voice slightly rough. The binding is definitely getting stronger. I can almost feel what you're thinking, not just the emotions. I can feel you too, she whispered. Your thoughts are like echoes in my mind. This is far more intimate than I expected. Neither of them pulled away despite, or perhaps because of, the intensity. Cassian's thumb stroked gently across her knuckles, such a small movement but it sent waves of sensation through the binding. She could feel how much he wanted to touch her more, to explore this connection, and also his rigid control as he held himself back, waiting for her to set the pace. What do you want? She asked, needing to hear him say it. Honestly? Right now, I want to kiss you. His eyes met hers directly, hiding nothing. I want to see if physical contact increases the binding further. But more than that, I want to kiss you because you're beautiful and fascinating and you've occupied my thoughts since the moment I saw you in chains in the throne room. But, he emphasized the word, only if you want the same. The binding may be pushing us but we still have choice. We can stop right here. Seraphine's heart, which beat so rarely, suddenly pounded in her chest. Through the binding she could feel the absolute truth of his words, could sense that he would stop if she asked, would step back and never pressure her. That certainty, that safety made her want to not step back. She swallowed, gathering courage she usually reserved for battle. I want to know what happens if we don't stop. Cassian's eyes darkened with desire that the binding carried to her in waves. He raised his free hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat, and cupped her face with infinite gentleness. His palm was warm against her cool skin, and she found herself leaning into the touch without conscious decision. "Last chance to change your mind," he murmured, his face now close enough that she could feel his breath. Instead of answering with words, Seraphine closed the final distance between them. The kiss started gentle, an exploration rather than a conquest, a question rather than a demand. His lips were soft against hers, warm and alive in ways that made her hyper-aware of her own coldness. But within seconds, the binding exploded with sensation that made their hand-holding seem like a whisper compared to a shout. Every barrier between their minds dissolved. Seraphine felt Cashin's desire, his tenderness, his joy at her willing participation. And he felt her response, shock giving way to pleasure, her tightly controlled need suddenly unleashed, 3 centuries of loneliness crashing against this moment of connection. The kiss deepened, no longer gentle but not violent either. It was passionate, desperate, both of them drowning in sensation, physical and emotional. Seraphine's wings spread involuntarily, wrapping partway around them, drawing him closer. Her hands fisted in his shirt, claws out but carefully angled away from his skin. Every point of contact sent new waves through the binding. His hands in her hair, her body pressed against his, the warmth of him seeping into her perpetual cold. Through the binding, she felt the moment his control nearly broke, felt how much he wanted to deepen the kiss further, to touch more of her, to explore this connection completely. But she also felt his determination to let her set the pace, to give rather than take. That realization, that he was holding back for her sake, broke something inside her. Some wall she'd maintained for decades crumbled, and suddenly she wasn't thinking about control or consequences or the pain that would come in 50 years when he died. She was only aware of now, of this moment, of the first genuine connection she'd felt in longer than she could remember. She pulled back just enough to breathe, though breathing was optional for her. Cashin's eyes were molten gold in the firelight, his chest heaving, his hands still tangled in her hair. Through the binding she felt his question, "Do we stop?" "No," she said, the word barely more than a breath. "Don't stop." What happened next was inevitable, natural, right in ways that defied all her expectations. They came together again, but this time there was no hesitation, no careful testing of boundaries. This was pure want, pure need, the binding singing between them as they explored each other with growing confidence. Seraphine had taken lovers before, over 3 centuries, it would have been strange not to. But those encounters had been physical only, pleasurable but ultimately empty. This was different. Every touch carried emotional weight, every kiss exchanged not just sensation but pieces of soul. Through the binding she experienced her own kiss from Cashin's perspective, felt how she tasted to him, understood the wonder he felt at being welcomed into her arms. And he felt her perspective too, the centuries of isolation finally ending, the terror and joy of connection, the way his warmth spread through her cold existence like sunrise after endless night. They made it to the bed somehow, though Seraphine couldn't have said how. Her elaborate court gown was a complicated hindrance until Cashin's clever fingers found the fastenings, and then it was sliding away. His own clothes followed, and then there was nothing between them but skin and want and the binding that made them more unified than separate. The first time he touched her wing, gently, carefully, with reverence, Seraphine nearly shattered. Wings were intimate, vulnerable, more sensitive than human skin. She'd never let lovers touch them before, too afraid of the vulnerability. But with Cashin, through the binding, she felt how beautiful he found them, how he touched them not to dominate but to worship, and the sensation was overwhelming. They came together finally, completely, and the binding went supernova. For several moments, Seraphine couldn't tell where she ended and Cashin began. She felt her own coldness through his senses, the strength of her grip that he loved rather than feared, the way her body moved with his in perfect synchronization. And she felt herself through his wonder, beautiful, powerful, perfect in ways she'd never believed about herself. He felt himself through her too, warm and vital and alive in ways that made her ache with how temporary he was. But in that moment, temporariness didn't matter. There was only now, only this, only the impossible perfect unity of two beings who shouldn't work together but somehow did. When it was over, they lay tangled together in the elaborate bed, breathing hard, him, and unnecessarily her, the binding still humming between them but softer now, satisfied. Cashin's hand traced idle patterns on her wing, and she realized she was purring, an actual vibrating sound in her chest that vampires only made when completely content. That was, Cashin started, then stopped, apparently unable to find adequate words. Unprecedented, Seraphine finished. Through the binding she could feel his agreement. I've never experienced anything like that. The binding made it more than just physical, he completed. I felt what you felt. I experienced my own touch from your perspective. That shouldn't be possible. None of this should be possible. She shifted, draping a wing over him like a blanket, an intimate gesture of protection and possession. We were forced into this marriage. We've known each other less than 2 days. We shouldn't work together at all. And yet we do. Cashin's arms tightened around her. Seraphine, I need you to understand something. What just happened, that wasn't just the binding. Yes, the magic made the sensation stronger, made the connection clearer. But what I feel for you, that's real. That's genuine. Through the binding, she felt the truth of his words, but also his fear, that she would dismiss this as magical coercion, that she would pull away now that the passion had faded. I know, she said quietly. I can feel it through the binding. Just as you can feel that she struggled with the admission, that I care for you too. More than I should after such a short time. More than is safe for someone who'll watch you age and die while I remain unchanged. Seraphine. But I can't not care, she continued, needing to say it all. The binding has made it impossible. You're in my head, in my emotions, in my very existence now. I tried to hate you, to see you as just another mortal obstacle. But you're not. You're kind and brave and frustrating and wonderful, and the words caught in her throat, centuries of self-protection warring with this new honesty. I think I'm already falling in love with you, and it terrifies me. Cashin pulled back enough to see her face, his expression fierce. Then we'll be terrified together. Because I'm already halfway in love with you too, princess. With your pride and your vulnerability, your strength and your loneliness, your beauty and your terrible, terrible sense of humor. My sense of humor is excellent, she protested weakly, but she was smiling, and through the binding, they both felt the joy radiating from that smile. It's really not. But he was smiling too, and then they were kissing again, gentler this time but no less meaningful. Outside their chamber, the obsidian court prepared for the evening's gatherings. Politics and intrigue continued their eternal dance. The Elder Council made their plans, and other vampires gossiped about the unprecedented marriage between princess and human. The world turned, uncaring and relentless. But inside the chamber of thorns and roses, two beings who shouldn't have worked found something neither expected. Genuine connection, unexpected love, and the beginning of a story that would defy every expectation placed upon it. Seraphine had been forced to marry a human as punishment. But his first touch, his first real touch, voluntary and tender, had made her beg for more. Not because the binding compelled her, but because she chose it. Because he'd shown her that intimacy didn't require domination, that vulnerability could be strength, that love might be terrifying but it was also the most alive she'd felt in 3 centuries. And for the first time since being dragged before the Elder Council in chains, Princess Seraphine Morganthia felt not punished but blessed. The garden had been Cashin's idea, built in the years after they'd left the Obsidian Court to make their home in the borderlands between vampire and human territories. A place where night roses grew beside day lilies, where shade and sunlight existed in careful balance, where 2 incompatible worlds learned to coexist. Seraphine stood in the twilight between day and night, watching her husband move among the flowers with movements that had grown slower, more careful over the decades. His hair was completely silver now, his face lined with the beautiful evidence of a life fully lived. He walked with a cane these days, though his mind remained as sharp as ever, his wit undiminished by time. 50 years. Nearly 50 years since that night in the chamber, since the binding had made them truly one, since they'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. They'd had a good life together, built a home, negotiated treaties that strengthened the peace between their peoples, raised several orphans they'd found during border conflicts who now had families of their own. They'd laughed and fought and loved with an intensity that the binding made impossible to diminish. And now the end approached. Cashin looked up, saw her watching, and smiled, the same warm smile that had first broken through her defenses. "You're brooding again. I can feel it through the binding. I'm allowed to brood." She moved to his side, taking his arm to steady him, though her touch was as much for her comfort as his support. "I'm about to watch my husband die while I remain young. That warrants some brooding. I'm 78, Seraphine. That's a good run for a human, especially one who spent his youth in military service." He cupped her still youthful face with his weathered hand. "We always knew this day would come. Knowing doesn't make it easier." She leaned into his touch, feeling through the binding that his life force was indeed fading, not quickly but steadily, inevitably. "I've loved you for 50 years. That's longer than most humans live at all. And yet it feels like no time at all. To you it probably is no time." He smiled sadly. "But to me it's been a lifetime. The best lifetime I could have asked for. You gave me 50 years of adventure, of love, of purpose beyond anything I could have achieved alone. Our children, even if we didn't birth them, have gone on to do remarkable things. The treaties we negotiated have held. Peace has lasted. That's a legacy worth being proud of." "I don't want legacy," Seraphine said fiercely, her wings spreading in agitation. "I want more time. I want another 50 years, another century. I want," her voice broke, "I want forever with you, and that's the one thing I can't have." Through the binding, Cashin felt her anguish, and it brought tears to his own eyes. "If I could give you forever, I would. But Seraphine, listen to me. These 50 years, this brief moment in your long existence, don't let it be defined by how it ends. Remember the joy, the love, the life we built together. Remember that we chose each other every single day, and that choice made both our lives richer. You're asking me to let you go. I'm asking you to live after I'm gone. To take what we had and use it to fuel another 1,000 years of life. Don't retreat into loneliness again. Don't close yourself off because loving me and losing me hurts. Instead, love fiercely, live fully, and know that somewhere in whatever comes after, I'll be cheering you on." Seraphine wanted to argue, to rage against the unfairness of mortality, to curse the binding that had made her love him so much that losing him would tear her apart. But through that same binding she felt his peace, his acceptance, his genuine joy at the life they'd shared. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't bitter. He was grateful. And she loved him too much to poison his final days with her grief. "I hate that you're right," she muttered, pulling him into an embrace that was careful of his fragile bones but desperate in its intensity. "I hate that you're being reasonable and wise when I want to be angry. That's what I'm here for. One last service to my vampire princess, being reasonable so you don't have to be." They stood together in the twilight garden, holding each other while the sky darkened and the first stars emerged. Through the binding they shared everything, her grief and his peace, his love and her devotion, the perfect unity they'd achieved over 50 years of choosing each other. "Thank you," Cashin finally said softly, "for giving me the best 50 years of any human's life. For loving me despite every reason not to. For showing me that even forced beginnings can lead to chosen endings." "Thank you," Seraphine countered, "for teaching me that 50 years of real love is worth more than centuries of safe isolation. For making me live instead of just exist. For being exactly the husband I needed even though I didn't know I needed you." They kissed one last time in the garden they'd built together. A kiss that held 50 years of history, of fights and laughter and passion and tenderness. The binding sang between them, carrying everything they'd been to each other, everything they'd meant, everything they'd built. When they separated, Cashin smiled. "I love you, Princess Seraphine Morganthia. I have loved you from the moment you tried to kill me with contempt in the throne room, and I will love you in whatever comes after. I love you, Lord Cashin Thorn. I loved you from the moment you offered me respect when you could have demanded submission, and I will love you for every century that remains to me." The binding pulsed one final time, as if sealing their words into something eternal, and Seraphine knew that even when Cashin died, even when the magical connection broke, what they'd built together would remain. She would carry him with her through all the centuries to come, not as a ghost or a tragedy, but as proof that love could transcend every barrier, every impossibility, every reason it shouldn't work. She had been forced to marry a human as punishment. But that first touch, that first voluntary tender touch, had given her 50 years of genuine happiness. And in the end that was worth any price. Even the price of eventually saying goodbye.